Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the podcast. Today we're sitting down for a bit of a chat over video with Rod Drury. Rod, how are you today?
Hey Paul, nice to actually see a human. How you doing?
Good. Hey, it's we haven't really caught up too much in recent times. You've been a little bit out of the spotlight, since handing over the reins at Xero. But of course, you're on the board there, and you're always doing lots of things behind the scenes. I think last time I bumped into you was at the Electrifying Conversations event in Auckland on sustainability and electric vehicles. What have you been up to? Maybe you just fill people in a little bit.
Oh, it's been really fun being out of the spotlight. Actually, I've been mountain biking quite a lot. That's sort of been the thing. I think when you're trying not to work, having something you can sort of achieve goals every day has been great. So been doing heaps of that. And obviously the board of Xero is pretty busy, so lots of good things there. And that's really it. Just a few little startups I've been playing with, but really don't want to do too much work. Kind of my theory was, with Xero, it was for 10, 12 plus years, a 24/7 business, and it just didn't stop. So I kind of figured I kind of crush my career into a shorter time period, and then when you're finished, I want to go back and do some more work. So I've been really enjoying just having a break, doing some high quality things, spending time with the kids finally, and then really thinking about a lot of the big projects that I think create platforms for New Zealand to be even more awesome. So yeah, I was quite reluctant to step back into the spotlight. I don't know how long I'll do it for. Certainly have no interest in sort of being out there, other than driving good change for New Zealand. And it was pretty inspiring seeing the likes of the Sam Morgans, Stephen Tyndalls, the Mowbrays, Rob Fife, how they really got things kicked off with this COVID crisis. And Sam basically pressured me and said, "Right, you got to get back out there." So I'll have a little spurt, and got some ideas I've been working on for the last few years, which I think are quite relevant to what we're doing now. And then hopefully I'll let others take the public face in a few months once we kind of know what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I'm very keen because you have a incredible view over small business, of course, and incredible insights into building a really successful global company out of New Zealand. And look, at this time we're still really right in the middle of the lockdown and the crisis. There's so much that's unknown in terms of what will be the impact for New Zealand, for the world, for the economy. But I think it's really important that we be looking ahead and not just completely focused on the here and now and the panic around how we feed ourselves and so on, but and how we pay the immediate bills, but that we're being as strategic as we can through this time. So that's like, I guess why I was very keen to hear from you. And you published something in the last few days and shared some of your own thoughts and things that I think maybe you've already been discussing with some of your I guess some of your peers in terms of business leaders that you've already mentioned. Can you walk us through really, what that thinking is? What are the things that are top of mind for you in terms of the approaches that we can be taking right now to really achieve that longer term success, and to I guess it's sort of strange to say it when we're in a world where a lot of people are dying, but to get the best out of what is an incredibly far from ideal scenario for the world right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like when you're in business, you're always balancing what you have to do right now. What your customers are asking for, what changes have to be made, so you just have to do it. You don't have a choice. And then you're also trying to think about how do you move towards your strategy, and you're also trying to make sure that you have the right amount of resources into making sure you keep nudging towards your long-term goals as well. So this crisis is exactly that, right? There are people that are in an incredibly scary place. I mean, you look at some of the business owners, some of our customers in the US, their businesses have just stopped. And most businesses, don't have many weeks, if any weeks, of cash. The US government's put out their PPP, is it payroll protection program or something like that, and you physically can't get through on the website or on the phone call to get your money. So there's people who may not be able to put food on the table for their children over the next, in the next few weeks to a month. So while it's great to think about the big things, which we'll talk about today, we're all feeling really bad for the short-term things which are happening right now. And, it's interesting seeing some of the tech companies really step up globally to do what some of the banks you would expect to do, what the government would do, because you can just do things faster. And we haven't got to that point in New Zealand yet, because our systems are holding well. But even in New Zealand, we're seeing people very, very scared. But man, I'm glad we're here and not somewhere else. So probably the best thing I've seen to think about the crisis is the framework that Roger Dennis put up. And I've known Roger for quite a few years. And he put together, he did some work on pandemics about 3 years ago. So he really did hit the ground running. And he came up with the 3-wave model. So the first wave, what are the things you need to do right now to keep people alive? And again, the Sams, the Stevens, the Nicks, Rob Fife, and all that got together on all those problems. So, can we make some ventilators here? Can we source PPE? We worked out that ventilators need oxygen, had to solve that problem. And now we're working on how do you do lots of testing and all of those sort of things. So there's a bunch of work that's happening in that wave 1. Wave 2 is how do we keep everybody working, and what can we do right now? What are the projects we can do that get people into work? And then wave 3 are those really exciting kind of nation building projects. So what I'm kind of focused on this week, I know that the wave 1 stuff's going quite well, is what are the wave 2 projects? And the sort of things that we've talked about there are things that are problems that we've been discussing for years. And what's kind of interesting about this crisis is, you may sort of be patient and wait 10 years for change. I think a lot of change will happen in the next 2 years, and it forces us to have a very crisp discussion around the things we can do. So there's a few obvious tech things. So one of the discussions we've had over the last year or so, which hasn't really bubbled through, is after the great work we did with UFB, where we essentially broke the chicken and egg and got fibre laid out to the home, and then any retail ISP could provide services over the top. And now we have so much better internet than Australia, even better internet than the US. Why wouldn't we do the same with 5G? We're a small, skinny country. We need lots of towers. We don't have a lot of population. So instead of having 2 or 3 network providers build up a whole lot of towers, and I'm sure they're doing lots of sharing and all that as well, but that's sort of long-term infrastructure investment that's quite different from running a publicly traded company that does lots of marketing and those things. So as I've been working with the Aussie super funds over the last 2 or 3 years, they have a really interesting problem. The Aussie super, because they've had compulsory savings, has $2 trillion of funds to invest. And what they'll do is they'll give that out to fund managers who, kind of have to invest in Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Alibaba, companies that don't pay domestic tax, but also are creating short-term and medium and long-term job issues. So the Aussie super funds have been dying to get big projects that they can spend. They want to write $5 to $10 billion checks. So infrastructure is perfect. And what's neat is that the government doesn't have to pay for these things. We just need to be clever and get the financial architecture right so that those big super funds who want to place money, they can get 3%, 5% these days on big, safe infrastructure projects. And these are largely fixed cost projects. And then you pay, then as people start connecting to the services, then they pay. So 5G feels like an awesome opportunity. We already know that it's worked for UFB. So we want to spend, $2 to $3 billion worth of fibre and tower infrastructure. We can go and get that from the Aussie and New Zealand super funds, and they can roll that out. And then we put a per connection charge. There's 2 million mobile connections. you know, $5 a month goes to your mobile infrastructure. Maybe it's $10 a month. And then you can see how you start funding that infrastructure, and then any sort of ISP or mobile ISP can provide services over the top, creates a whole lot of new opportunities and those sort of things. So we've talked about that. Chris Farfoy is on point. So what I've been doing is just directly asking the question: is Chris, can we do this or not? We don't have to wait months. If this all makes sense, you've thought about it before, make a decision now. The other really big one is PayWave. I mean, we've pissed around on that for years and years and years, right? With 4 different commerce ministers over 10 years, we've talked about the domestic debit network and the domestic credit network, and that just requires some leadership. Maybe we've got to put a small charge on FPOS to balance that network up. But you know, we've already seen it work in Australia. When I used to go to Aussie, you know, then I never pulled my credit card out of my pocket, and we just look crazy when a small business owner has sitting there with no PayWave on their device. But what's happened now is nobody wants to touch the terminal, so there's never been a better time to deal with the PayWave issue. So again, that's on Chris Farfoy's portfolio. He knows all about it. The last 4 commerce ministers have done all the work, so they need to show some courage, get all the banks in a room and lay out how it's going to be. So again, this is pressure time. We can't wait. We need to move. And I think the really big one, and sorry, you go, Paul.
Oh yeah. So with that one, what do you see as the challenge? What are you hearing as the challenge? Because Australia, I guess it's sort of understandable why they moved to that sort of tap to pay type model, because they didn't have the success of a FPOS model as we had in New Zealand, which of course has been very low cost, incredibly successful. It sort of really led the world. But because of the great success of that, moving to a tap to pay type model, which comes with, at this stage, with higher costs, we haven't been able to move forward. So is there a way to bring down those costs of the contactless type payments, or do you think it is a matter of sort of increasing the costs of FPOS to really to make that viable?
Yeah, it's quite a complex thing. We can talk about that for an hour, but just the very high level of it is because we have an FPOS model which is really cheap. So a store owner pays $30 to $50 a month for that mobile connection and has no transaction fees. So the domestic debit network works really, really well. But the banks don't make any money out of it. If they go through PayWave, which is the domestic credit network, those little FPOS devices have both networks on that flow through them. And what's happened is that Visa and MasterCard, and there is a place for credit, it's convenient, you should pay for that, but Visa and MasterCard obviously clip the ticket and they share that with the banks. So the banks then get a transaction fee. So the economic incentives are for the banks to allow that fee to be charged, because they can clip the ticket. So to get the economic incentives right, we need to probably, maybe there's a per dip charge of a few cents per transaction, but we can also regulate the interchange rate, and the right people should pay for credit. If you're paying, it shouldn't be the merchant, because what happens if you're sitting there in a corner dairy and somebody walks up and wants to tap, that's a 3% charge that the merchant pays, which is inflation across all small businesses. So we need to make it so that the right people pay for the ability to use credit, and we need to obviously be able to have contactless domestic debit so that the money changes hands. So effectively what's happening is our great FPOS network, the transaction volume on that will fall, and more transactions goes into these overseas credit networks. So the money moves offshore, and a merchant doesn't even have confidence for like 4 or 5 weeks that they're actually going to get the money, because that can be pulled back. So the work's all been done with that. It's been done 3 or 4 times. It just needs now for the Commerce Minister to get everyone in the room, threaten the banks to regulate and do the right thing, and make sure the economic incentives are right. And that might be a small per dip fee of 5 to 10 cents. But remember, moving money is moving bits of data. There is no cost in moving money. That should cost fractions of a cent. But I think, we'd be happy if we can pay, 5 cents a transaction or whatever, so that, we can use a domestic debit in a contactless way. The other interesting thing is the battle that's going on between Apple and the Australian banks. So Apple won't allow the secure enclave, and they won't allow apps that allow the phone to be to have that kind of security key. And so then you run into the problem of, even if you built a kind of triangulation type architecture, where you might scan a QR code or something, whatever it is, that sort of beacon, which allows you to connect the merchant with the person that's buying the money. Both Apple and Google make that very, very hard. And it's so interesting watching the fight play out with the Australian banks as mobile carriers, and Apple and Google trying to get into that transaction. So there's all of that to untangle as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that it's certainly something pretty interesting to watch, but these are genuine challenges that that need to be addressed. And, I guess, sometimes it requires government to, to step in and take a level of control. I mean, it's really interesting, and, to me, it's somewhat worrying, just the way that the biggest global tech companies keep growing and growing, and how much that sort of squashes the local players. In New Zealand yesterday, we heard from the local, the local media companies that are, already under incredible pressure, prior to COVID-19, from the likes of Facebook and so on, and then they're sharing around their frustration with government spending all these advertising dollars are just flowing straight out the door, and back to Silicon Valley, and not supporting the local sort of media entities here to the same degree. And look, I think there are so many challenges associated with that, and the idea of I guess Apple being able to clip the ticket, or to a reasonably large degree on transactions through an iPhone or an Apple Watch, and not allowing other players to compete there is certainly something that's unhelpful to keeping a balance to things globally. So definitely in agreement with those thoughts there, Rod. And so what else is on your mind around this sort of wave 2 type scenario?
Yeah, so the big one now is the overseas investment office. So I spent a lot of time down in Queenstown. There's and tourism has just stopped. And the scary thing is how long will it be till we can have Australians and other people come through? Well, if a vaccine is 18 months away, and there's a bit of optimism that maybe that can be under 12 months away, but still, then it's got to be deployed at scale, and you've got to prove that it works. So it's hard to imagine international travel that's convenient starting in the next 18 months or so. It's like, holy shit, that's just such a big thing to get your head around. So a whole lot of jobs just don't exist in Queenstown, in that tourism space. And then you look back and you see then there's a whole lot of construction projects that are dependent on that tourism. So 2 or 3 years ago, when the new government came in, they had that very populist reaction of, based on our equality value, that people shouldn't be able to buy land here and build. And so we kind of closed the door, so people can't sell their places to people overseas. And part of that was around the housing crisis, but of course that made no sense, because they just aren't the sort of places that people from overseas aren't buying the sort of houses that have an impact on the housing crisis. I mean, that was just fake. But anyway, so now you have to ask the question: do we open up New Zealand for construction projects? We know that we are a bolt hole, and the amazing work that our Prime Minister's doing is even enhancing that. And you'd have to think we could sell 1,000 to 2,000 sections for $5 to $10 million plus construction projects. Not completely sight unseen, because a lot of the people that have been wanting to build down here have been here, and they're frustrated they can't buy here. They know the locations, they can see videos, they can get online. I reckon we could actually, be doing projects where the architects kick off pretty quickly in the next month or so, and get that going, and then start, we can get earthworks and all those things going. So I reckon that's a very clear way that we could create another $10 billion of construction value and getting that money in. So then it ripples through all the cafes and all the services and all those things that go through. So that's a very easy one. And that one's on David Parker. So he's the one who really pushed for us to close things down. So what I've been doing is putting very clear pressure on him to ask the question. We don't have time to wait. If you're running a construction firm and you've got, payroll bills of $10,000 to $20,000 a month, you can't wait for 6 months. So it's a very easy question. And I would urge anybody to email him. I talked to Mike Hoskins this morning. We can get him on the radio. That's an easy one. So say yes or no. If it's yes, let's go, because we don't have time.
I agree. Yep. And
look, I took a lot of shit for that Peter Thiel, getting Peter Thiel in here, because it was populist for people to say so. But I'll go back. Well, you may not like Peter's politics and all those things that have played out. At the time, having someone like Peter who was really interested in our country and the way that he could help us. I've got great friends who have from the US who managed to buy places in Hawke's Bay before things closed down. They've been nothing but helpful. They consume no services. They don't really use roads. They don't use hospitals. They don't use education. They pay GST on everything. They buy their house, they buy their cars, they create jobs. But the connection that you get, the way that they help us build our businesses overseas, and they're so evangelical for New Zealand. They're bringing their friends down. Like we've had so many interesting and connected people here that we're having great conversations with, and it's nuts that we don't encourage them to be here. And you could go much further. We could, at the moment, the way the tax system works, people, can have to be here under 6 months. I mean, why don't we do a deal where we do like a maximum of $2 million of tax for all of your worldwide income, so they can stay here longer. And that's just money that we wouldn't see. We could compete and absolutely pull people down here. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong, because you're balancing that up against our values of equality and the environment. But now is absolutely the time to have that discussion, because I think there are some good easy wins there, and we can get it right. And it may not be all of New Zealand. We might pick some zones like the Tuki Valley, around that golf course up in Auckland, where a bunch of Silicon Valley people are building and buying there, and Queenstown, obviously.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of wisdom to that, and I understand, to a degree why government have locked down so that property's not sold offshore. But right now, look, if we weigh everything up, I think it's a pretty quick calculation to see that this has to be good for New Zealand. And look, the rest of the world looks to New Zealand as just such an incredible location, such an incredible place that's not overpopulated and crowded and crazy. It's very much is considered a paradise. And why not open the door and let a few more people in? And it's got to play out well. I would imagine, unless we're handing over the keys to run the country to random people from other parts of the world. But other than that, I'm pretty keen on that approach, Rod. Makes a huge amount of sense. And is there anything else in that view that you want to delve into? I know you've really been looking into environmental things from a New Zealand perspective, and involved in a lot of discussions around how we could move to even more environmentally sort of friendly approaches to transport, to electricity generation. What are the things that are on your mind from that perspective, Rod?
Yes, again, that's a pretty big discussion. But over, when I finished at Xero and I had time, and I spent lots of time on my bike thinking, I've been really kind of racking my brains around what could we do that is a platform that we can just build on that. Lots of businesses can create, and gives us a sustainable competitive advantage as a country. What's our version of Saudi Arabian oil? And as I kind of thought about it, the answer actually came out quite quickly. It's renewable electricity. We have hills and we have rain. Australia doesn't have rain, doesn't have many hills either, so they can't do it. And parts of Europe don't have hills either, and so they're doing lots of things with wind and solar. So I started pulling the string on that, and it was really interesting. What I found that we're sort of 80+% renewables right now, and I started pulling the string on that even more, finding, well, why aren't we 100%? And the answers were actually super interesting. So what I found was we only store like a few months worth of water, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of crazy. Why wouldn't we store like more than a season? But we kind of stopped building dams. So that was interesting. And then I started talking to the strategy groups at some of the generators and electricity retailers. And I can't remember exactly what the numbers were. I've got them written down somewhere, but like Fonterra is a really big user of energy for industrial heating processes. And I think the numbers were something like the price of electricity is $65 per unit, and the price of sort of coal and gas is $45 a unit. So, well, so they are quite rationally not using electricity. So it was clear then the price of electricity is too high. And then you go, okay, well, what makes the cost of electricity if it's just rain? If it's just water? Well, it's the cost of the infrastructure, and the more units you put through it, then the unit price must come down. So, okay, well, that's interesting. So then you go, okay, well, what if we had a massive amount more water? Like, why don't we store 3 or 4 years worth of water, which seems to be good for the environment because you can flush rivers, you can do more plant-based proteins. It's a good place to store things. And it was really clear the best battery of all is a lake. If you're doing solar, you've got to store energy somewhere, which requires a whole lot of batteries. Whereas with water, you just sort of hold it up in the air behind a wall, and when you want to turn it on, which you can do in about 15 minutes, you can just generate more electricity. So water is both the energy source, and it's this big potential battery. So I thought, well, that all kind of makes sense. So then I said, well, being in the Hawke's Bay, we know what it's like to try to get a dam away. And that environment value is really, really key. So let's park the supply side. I think what we've got to do, there's not that many exciting things happening in New Zealand, certainly from a political thing. There's no real projects that we get behind. So then I started thinking about, well, technology's moved along quite a lot in the last few years. What are the projects that New Zealanders would actually want? And their thinking is, if we can lay out those really exciting things, then people might say, okay, well, maybe we do sacrifice a small amount of land, and maybe it's not even a sacrifice because it's actually good having that much water. But if we can not talk about just building dams, but talk about what are the cool things we could do and get that vision going, then you can have a mature discussion about whether we should sacrifice a small amount of land. So you look at tech. I mean, the obvious one is electric cars, and the numbers of us not importing oil for transport is really interesting. Our balance of payments flip. And as an island nation, that feels like a really good thing to do. And then I was actually listening to the a New Zealand electric vehicle podcast driving up to Auckland one day with Dee on that. And they had a guy called Dr. Rod Badcock. And he's down at Victoria University, and he was fascinating. Perhaps you can put a link to that podcast in the show notes. But he was talking about they've got a group down at Victoria University that's doing superconducting electric motors, which they're using right now as stabilizers on Japanese bullet trains. But they're part of a global consortium working with NASA, dealing with electric aviation. And they've just passed this, and this was probably 18 months ago, passed this threshold of 15 kilowatts of power per kilo of engine mass, was where electric engines start getting viable for flight. So it's quite realistic in the next sort of 10 years that he was saying that we'll be able to fly 737-sized aircraft using electricity. And that just blew my mind. If you think about that from a New Zealand point of view, where 100% of our domestic aviation market is very short haul. We can't fly more than 2 hours or you're somewhere in the ocean. So if you were doing electric flying in Finland, you might have a cool electric plane sitting next to an A380 that's going to fly for 15 hours. What we can do is say, look, we're going to completely change our domestic aviation fleet, and then you put that up for New Zealanders and anyone who's environmentally friendly. They go, heck yeah, we would love to be able to fly really cheap because we've made electricity cheap, and also we would love to fly with no carbon guilt and see our country. So if we say, look, our goal, our vision is to have 100% domestic aviation that's carbon free, everyone goes, yeah. And there's so many other examples. Think about Auckland public transport. Maybe you need some light rail. I doubt it, because that just feels to me that sort of old technology. And we're seeing, China's putting a phenomenal amount of electric buses. I want to say like 50,000 electric buses on per month, some number we can't understand. And, when I got to Auckland and you drive up to Albany, you see those park and rides, which are overflowing with cars at 9:30 in the morning. They're parked up grass verges, all of those sort of things. That's nuts that you even drive your car to park somewhere to go and catch a bus. Wouldn't it be cool if we had these small electric buses, which are super cheap because there's not many moving parts and eventually they won't need drivers, so they're super cheap. And every Auckland commuter has a mobile phone, so we know what they did last week. We know where they need to be next week. We know what the weather's going to be. So imagine if we were importing cheap electric buses, and we became really good at writing the fleet management software that knew where everybody needed to go. And then as new buses or whatever came onto the network, it just kept reconfiguring every day, so we knew where things needed to be. So you get a ping on your mobile phone the night before saying, hey, your personalized bus is coming through Milford at 8:05. You're going to arrive at work at 8:26. So you walk out, you've got a whole lot of buses, small little buses with 8 to 10 people that are just going slowly 25 k's down the streets with no driver. You jump on that. As you get closer to the motorway, they start chaining together. So there's a few of them. Just before the bridge, they pull over. You get a message on your phone, jump from carriage B to carriage F. Just walk down for 30 seconds. Everyone chains over the bridge, and then you flick off over to Westmere or somewhere. That's all very possible now. And I've been chatting to the Mayor of Wellington as one of these projects. Why don't we make Wellington the right-hand drive test lab? So I was chatting to the CEO of Zoox yesterday. There's another German company I'm talking to tomorrow. And, we've already proven with Kitty Hawk, the autonomous flying taxi stuff that's happening in the middle of the South Island, that the government's got behind and then New Zealand's got behind. Well, why don't we get behind electric buses and smart networks? So, these are the things we can do as connected business people, is reach out to the CEOs of those companies, say, look, we have thin layers of government. We can work with you as long as it's all safe. We can even use our New Zealand Super Fund money to bring local investment to fund those local trials. So you can keep going with your business plan. We'll fund that locally because we're going to get a share in it and we get benefit from it and make those things happen. So those are the sort of awesome projects that are, just really, really fun that we can do here in New Zealand.
Yeah, look, I think that makes a lot of sense too, because as a smaller nation, we can get rolling and actually get those things into play, reasonably easily compared to probably a lot of other markets. And look, as you say, with the with Whisk and the autonomous air taxi testing that's been going on in the South Island, New Zealand seems to be a great place with that right sort of balance from a regulatory and a safety perspective. There's so much incredible talent here that we can tap. Xero is a testament to that. Rocket Lab is a testament to that. There's so much that can be done here, and if we just sit back, then these things don't happen. So some of it has to be facilitated at a government and a local government level. But of course, a big chunk of it is down to those in business who have got the vision to to get in and get these things rolling. And to set up those partnerships. And I see recently that there's a lot of work going on in terms of moving to electric ferries, and so that stuff's happening in Auckland. But look, this could be happening in the air. It can really be happening with public transport, and I really like that thought of linking together small potentially autonomous vehicles with an app. To really solve some of those transport problems, some of those reasons that people don't use public transport today, because it takes them twice as long to get to their destination as it does if they, jump in their own vehicle and clog up the roads. And technology is absolutely, the key that can join these dots up and solve those problems. So that's great. Now, Rod, your experience with Xero means you've seen the insides and outsides and so many aspects of small business. And of course, New Zealand as a nation, we have our big firms, like the Xeros, which everyone knows about, but we also have hundreds of thousands of small businesses. And of course, now is a time when a lot of those are in jeopardy, particularly those involved in the areas of tourism, those that are involved in entertainment, food and beverages and so on. But there are opportunities, right? What are you seeing out there where you think or approaches that you think are useful for small businesses to be taking at the moment in terms of preparing themselves for the future?
Yeah, so seeing lots of really interesting things, and it's so impressed when you see how fast some of these businesses have moved. So, the good thing about, there is some positives around this sort of month of lockdown, and I think it's caused everybody to be very introspective. I know some people are really lonely and they're on their own, and it's really tough. But for a lot of people who are just running so fast, being able to have some quality, people are actually saying they're having quality times with their families. This is a special time, and it's a quality time to think as well. And so I know that it's just slowed me down, and now I've had time to think strategically. So I'm pretty clear about what I want to do personally over the next 4 or 5 years, and I hope that other people think that. And I think business people are thinking that as well. What's been interesting being in Hawke's Bay is there's a lot of food producers who were producing food which people need, but they weren't part of the supermarket channel. So it's been fascinating watching them pivot very quickly and putting direct-to-consumer sites out there, quickly connecting to Shopify. Not building complex sites where you can take a carrot and a beetroot and put it all into a box. Just saying, look, here's small vegetables, large vegetables box. Which one do you want? So I brought a box of veggies from Reed Produce the other day. I've been getting vegan bread mix from Oh My Goodness Bread and Hastings. Been getting avocados to go on that bread and some lemons from Twisted Citrus. There's been so many cool food producers, which aren't that tech, that are using this massive investment that the industry's made and really easy to use applications and back-end software and connecting to the courier companies to make all of that work. So I think everyone's got to think about how they digitize their business. The really big thing going on, because there are businesses that just can't exist at the moment, is the government's put a lot of work into aid. So what we've been doing as part of Xero, what the team there's been doing is, trying to unpack all of that, make it really easy to understand, make software changes so we can manage all of that. And then the next wave will be how do we get assistance from the banking industry out to small businesses as well and manage all of that. And, and again, this is a shock for the banks that aren't fast at moving at the best of times, but they're working incredibly hard to interpret what the rules are, because banks are very motivated to not have businesses fall over, because then their mortgage book is at risk, right? So they're incredibly incentivized to get the right amount of money to small businesses. And again, that's a big collaboration. And in the US, as I said, almost the central government just can't do it. That's what the evidence shows. So a lot of the big global companies are now working to try to get those things done, because you can't take, days matter in the sort of situation. So there's a lot of good things to do, but I think everyone now has had like a month of working digitally. And remember, some businesses are absolutely cranking now because they can easily work from home. And I think for those businesses, if they can employ, create jobs, show others, that's definitely important.
Yeah, that's good, Rod. Yeah, and look, I'm certainly with you on this. The idea of I guess digitizing our businesses more and transformation. And look, I think in New Zealand, where Xero now has a pretty massive market share, the competition have certainly modernised their offerings too. I think we take for granted a level of digitization and automation, a much more efficient way of handling our accounting. Look back to those old days, there were sort of manual processes to pull through bank transactions each day, and that's so heavily automated now. And the way in which our various apps and things can tie together is fantastic. But I think there are so many more of those opportunities. And
we're challenging our team internally. I'm saying to them all the time. So we've been working on e-invoicing for a long time, right? Having to wait to get paid on the 20th of the month makes no sense. Effectively, some businesses are funding bigger businesses on the chain. The way they're, trying to push the construction industry, but the construction industry is terrible for having larger entities being funded basically on a whole bunch of smaller companies. So, things like, and this is the discussions we're having with government now, let's absolutely push e-invoicing hard, and then we can change the culture. So you pay on invoice. If you get an invoice and you've done the work, and the invoice data comes into your system, and then you can approve it straight away, why wouldn't the money move straight away and just speed up the velocity of money within the economy? And that's going to be really important. So I've been challenging our teams on that, to how can we speed all of this up? And this is where we can start collaborate with, there is an inherent public-private collaboration going on. We pushed online GST, pushing e-invoicing really hard. Another thing that's really interesting is, we've kind of relaxed and been a small brother to Australia, a really small brother to the US. But we're kind of unique in that, we've seen the world move more towards Asia. We have a free trade agreement with Asia. And we see that the values that we have, the way that we operate, are actually quite different to some of these other markets. And dare I say it, the markets that aren't burdened by democracies. And, what's interesting is seeing this kind of second internet start in China. And what they've done is they've pretty much mandated that every business is on WeChat, not just the business, but their bank account numbers. So effectively, there's a directory of every business. There's an authoritative place where everybody is. And once you're connected, everyone's trusted because they know who they are from an identification point of view. I'm sure there's a whole lot of bad surveillance stuff that's going, but it does accelerate commerce. So some of the interesting things we can do it in a much more open way with privacy, without government surveillance. But having a real push to why don't we have every New Zealand business in a business directory? And again, it would be open. So, we would be able to use it. Mile would be able to use it. SAP would be able to use it. But we have a goal of let's get every New Zealand business with an electronic address, all verified, perhaps every consumer as well, so that you can go and transact faster. And these are things where the kind of North Korean way would be a bit more active and the New Zealand way would be incredibly passive, but somehow kind of connecting the dots on those things and doing it in the right way with clear values, with privacy and security is really interesting. And I think that's, I've always pushed for having a CTO, and, we've got a new digital council out there. Those are the kind of interesting projects that might take a few years, but they really move things on. And I think the challenge is creating the right forum to have those discussions and then demanding more of the government to actually move on these things. If you've done the work, make the decision. Don't just keep punting it like we saw with PayWave. Sorry, I just had to have a little rant there.
Yeah, no, actually, look, there's some, there's some great things in what you raised there, and look, I'd be really interested, how much difference would it make in New Zealand if, and look, I'll put the blame, more squarely at our bigger businesses, but I know it's not just the bigger organisations. But yeah, often there seems to be so much red tape just to getting a bill paid when work has been carried out, and the impact that it actually has on small entities is massive. And I mean, you would know that through Xero better than anybody. But cash flow is the lifeblood of a small business, and when you get an entity that mucks you around, even just waiting to 20th of the following month for a payment, as is still so common, in a lot of parts of the New Zealand economy, can be really choking to a small business. And then there are those that will string it out, even more, and use other businesses basically as a funding line for their own entity. It's incredibly challenging to our economy. So yeah, I'm pretty keen on that approach. When when an invoice gets fed out electronically, you should tick it off, and it should get paid. So that's great. Now, any other thoughts that you can share, Rod, in terms of how our organisations should go about rethinking what they do, because there is that need right now to be stepping back a little bit. I think most smaller businesses are going to have pain either at a small scale or a large scale. And in some of those cases, the businesses may not survive. So we've got people that need to step back and rethink, well, what should my next business be? Other ones need to be looking and figuring out, well, now we've kind of pressing reset on things a bit. What should that future picture look like? I mean, you've done through Xero, you've managed to think incredibly strategically. I think I recall you saying at some point, you're usually looking sort of, half a decade to a decade out on things. Of course, there's going to be a need to sort of balance that, right? So any suggestions and advice that you can offer to our New Zealand, business owners and those involved in leadership?
Yeah, so from an individual thing, what do you do next? How do you tweak your business? So it's survival mode right now, and we're gonna be in an environment where we're kind of on our own for about 18 months. And so obviously we have to do quick work to make sure that we work in this new environment, which will probably mean some digitisation. But what's also happening is the rest of the world now is being trained to operate through Zoom or Hangouts or Skype, whatever your poison is. But so that means it doesn't matter. Location doesn't matter. And what's interesting about New Zealand, and even more so because we are probably going to be freeing up faster than everyone else, and the rest of the world is going to want to be here. And this is the thing that blew me away when I started raising money in the States, is a lot of people around the world have a fantasy relationship with here. They imagine being in New Zealand, they want to come down here, and they love connecting with Kiwis. So what's happened over the last month is a lot of people now have worked out actually how you work with Zoom, how you manage having kids at home, it doesn't matter when you do calls. If you're selling overseas, you don't have to do calls between 9 and 5. You can actually do, calls at 7 or 8 at night, or catch the UK first thing in the morning. So I think what's interesting now is, we've always talked about, can you export services? And a lot of companies have done that just because they saw the opportunity, they saw how much cheaper we were. But now I think we've all been demonstrated that it's possible to use the tools. And in all of the other markets, they're going to have, they're going to have longer lockdown, and they're not going to be traveling for even a longer period. So, if they're buying from from people in their own country, or getting great service that's cost effective from providers in New Zealand, that's really interesting. So this is, you know, some of the silver lining of this is we're all being trained in that we can sell anywhere in the world now. So building businesses, you know, where you move from a market size of 4 million people to hundreds of millions is super exciting. And it's, the way that you get out there now, you don't have to go and spend a whole lot of money in marketing. You can use social media to get into those communities. You can just dial into, some sort of supplier community or whatever your special interest is, with it be any sort of marketing. You can do virtual conferences. You can educate, get a Harvard degree, I'm sure, online, and just be part of those global communities. And imagine that, how cool it is to be able to live in New Zealand, look out and see the sun and go for a mountain bike, and then also being able to sell right through the day and into the night just from your own computer. So I think those opportunities have always been clear. Now they're super clear.
Love it. Thanks, Rod. Yeah, and look, we're on the same page on that stuff, and we're going to keep these conversations going in terms of what can we do. There's a mindset aspect to it. We've got to be looking out for those opportunities, but we've also got to draw and learn from others, and that's why I really appreciate you sharing some of your time with us today. Because you've got so much real world experience, so you're not just talking theory here. This is the real deal. Now I know we've burnt through a chunk of your time, Rod. Were there any other bits and pieces that you wanted to chat about before we finish up?
No, I think I've done. That's been very cathartic. Thank you for allowing me to vent. This was like a psychiatrist session, so thank you.
Always great to catch up, Rod. And look, for those that haven't heard Rod on previous episodes, then take a look at our back catalogue there of the New Zealand Business Podcast. Rod's also been on the electric vehicle podcast. That he mentioned that show earlier, the New Zealand Tech Podcast, and of course we've got a bunch of shows there on our little independent podcasts NZ network. So well worth having a look in there. The New Zealand Everyday Investor, probably of interest to people at the moment, and then the new show that we have from Vincent Heringer, of course, the founder of Unlimited Magazine and Idealog, who is doing this climate business. So that's another one well worth looking out for. So hey, thanks everybody for joining us on the show, and thanks again, Rod, for taking the time, and we'll catch everybody either on one of our audio episodes or on one of our live streams as we continue these chats during this period. And look, wishing all the best to everyone at this time.